The mist hasn't yet burned away from the Bricklieve Mountains when you reach the summit. Your breath clouds in the cold air, each footstep crunching through heather still wet with dew, and then you see them. Cairns rising from the limestone plateau like ancient watchtowers, their stones dark against the slowly lightening sky. This is Carrowkeel. And if you're here at the right moment, on the summer solstice, you'll witness something that hasn't changed in 5,000 years. A beam of sunset light threading through a roof box above a tomb entrance, illuminating a chamber where the dead once lay. Most people know about Stonehenge. They've seen the postcards, the tourist photos, the summer solstice celebrations broadcast on television, but Stonehenge is just one sentence in a much longer story. A story written in stone across the landscapes of Ireland and Britain, in places where fewer crowds gather, and where the connection between earth and sky feels less staged, more primal. These are the forgotten megalithic sites, the stone circles that don't make international headlines, the passage tombs that archaeologists excavated once and then left to the sheep in the rain. Here's what makes these places different from the monuments everyone knows. Many of them became sacred again, centuries or even millennia after their builders vanished. When Celtic peoples arrived in Ireland during the Iron Age, they found these ancient stones already standing, already mysterious, already powerful. The Celts didn't build these monuments, they inherited them. And their religious specialists, the Druids, wove these prehistoric structures into their own sacred geography, creating layers of meaning that we're still trying to untangle today. This is the challenge that haunts anyone who studies these sites. The megalithic builders who raised these stones between 3500 and 2000 BC left us their architecture, but not their words. We don't know what they called themselves, what gods they worshipped, or what ceremonies they performed inside stone circles and passage tombs. Then came a gap. Centuries when these sites might have been abandoned, avoided, or simply forgotten. When the Celts arrived, when historical Druids emerged in the last few centuries before Christ, they discovered these ancient places and claimed them as their own. But were they continuing traditions that had somehow survived, or were they inventing new meanings for structures they couldn't understand? We can't answer that question with certainty. What we can do is visit these places, study their alignments and their landscapes, and try to understand why both the original builders and their later inheritors found them sacred. Carrowkeel occupies a different world from the manicured grass of more famous monuments. To reach it, you drive narrow roads through County Sligo, past stone walls and small farms, until the Bricklieve Mountains rise before you. Even the approach feels significant. These aren't the highest peaks in Ireland, but they command the landscape, their limestone ridges shaped by glaciers into dramatic parallel valleys. 14 passage tombs scatter across these ridges, though some are so degraded that only archaeologists can identify them with certainty. The best preserved is Cairn G, and it holds a secret that connects it directly to Ireland's most famous monument, Newgrange. Above the tomb's entrance, the builders carved out a roof box, an opening separate from the passage itself, positioned precisely to catch the setting sun at summer solstice. Martin Byrne, who has studied these cairns for decades and whose research preserved much of what we know about their astronomy, documented how this roof box functions. Unlike Newgrange, where winter solstice sunrise illuminates the passage for exactly 17 minutes, Cairn G admits summer solstice sunset for weeks on either side of midsummer. The beam enters the chamber through the roof box and slides across the rear wall, lighting different areas as the sun's setting position shifts along the Ox Mountains on the western horizon. But there's more. The entire chamber of Cairn G is oriented toward Knocknaria, the distinctive flat-topped mountain to the west, where Queen Maeve's cairn crowns the summit. This alignment isn't random. It marks the setting position of the moon at its northern extreme during the major lunar standstill, an 18.6-year cycle that ancient astronomers tracked with remarkable precision. Several other cairns at Carrowkeel share this orientation, suggesting that the moon mattered as much to these builders as the sun, if not more. Archaeological excavations in 1911 revealed human remains in several cairns, cremated bones, carefully gathered and placed in the chambers, along with pottery and stone beads made from jasper and serpentine. The bones showed evidence of deliberate defleshing before cremation, indicating complex mortuary rituals that prepared the dead for their journey. Recent DNA analysis has revealed family connections between people buried at Carrowkeel and those interred at other passage tomb complexes across Ireland, suggesting networks of kinship and belief that stretched across the island. Beyond the cairns themselves, researchers discovered something equally remarkable: the remains of a prehistoric village, small circular hut foundations scattered across the plateau. These structures raised questions that archaeology still struggles to answer. Did the builders of the tombs live here year-round, or did they gather seasonally for rituals and construction work? Were these permanent dwellings or temporary shelters for pilgrims who came to witness the solstice alignments? The Carrowkeel complex forces us to think about megalithic sites as more than isolated monuments. This was a ritual landscape where the natural topography, the mountains, the valleys, the sight lines to distant peaks, mattered as much as the constructed elements. The builders chose this location not despite its exposed, windswept character, but because of it. From these heights, you can see across vast stretches of Ireland, watching weather systems roll in from the Atlantic, tracking the sun and moon as they move along horizons marked by mountains whose names we'll never know in the original language. When later Celtic peoples encountered Carrowkeel, they found these ancient tombs already weathered, their builders long gone. Irish mythology preserves hints of how they interpreted these places as Sid, entrances to the otherworld, where the Tuatha De Danann had retreated after their defeat by mortal invaders. Whether Druids performed ceremonies at Carrowkeel specifically, we cannot know. But the landscape itself, the mountains, the cairns, the sightlines, would have spoken to anyone who understood the sacred geometry of earth and sky. If Carrowkeel represents the complexity of megalithic astronomy, the hill of Uisneach embodies something different: the idea of a sacred center, an axis where the human world connects to divine powers. Located in County Westmeath, Uisneach stands at what was considered the geographical and mythological heart of Ireland, the point where the 5 ancient provinces met. The name itself is contested, possibly derived from Uisha, water, combined with references to the god Necton. But whatever its etymology, Uisneach's significance in Irish tradition cannot be overstated. This was the place where sovereignty was granted, where the goddess Eriu gave Ireland to the Gaelic people, where the boundaries between the mortal realm and the otherworld grew thin enough to cross. The most prominent feature on the summit is a massive limestone boulder called the Ail na Mirian, the Stone of Divisions. Nearly 6 meters tall and weighing over 30 tons, this glacial erratic was clearly recognized as special in prehistory. An earthen bank was constructed around it to mark its importance. According to tradition, this stone marked the meeting point of provincial boundaries, but it meant more than political geography. The Ail na Mirian functioned as an omphalos, a naval stone, the point from which all of Ireland could be measured and understood. Around this central stone, the hill holds the remains of numerous monuments spanning thousands of years. There's a probable Neolithic passage tomb on the summit, now so degraded that only archaeologists can identify it. There are Bronze Age burial mounds, ring ditches that once surrounded cairns or standing stones, and a complex figure-of-8 earthwork called Rathnu that shows evidence of ritual fires deliberately kindled and then suddenly quenched, perhaps with water, perhaps with earth, in ceremonies whose meaning we can only guess. But Uisneach's most powerful tradition concerns fire itself. According to the Dinshenchas, the medieval lore of places, the very first Beltane fire in Ireland was lit here by a druid named Mide. The text claims this fire burned for 7 years, spreading its light and power across the 4 quarters of the island. Every hearth in Ireland was said to be lit from Uisneach's flame, creating a network of sacred fire that unified the land. Beltane, celebrated on the 1st of May, marked the beginning of summer in the Celtic calendar. It was one of the 4 great fire festivals, a liminal time when the barriers between worlds grew permeable. At Uisneach, according to tradition, the great Beltane fire was kindled in ritual fashion, and from its flames, Fires on other sacred hills would be lit in response. A chain of sacred fire visible across the landscape, stitching the land together through light and smoke. The historical records mention a Mordile, a great assembly, held at Uisneach during Beltane, where Druids gathered to perform ceremonies and where high kings received sovereignty through complex rituals involving the goddess Eru herself. One tradition describes a king-making ceremony that required prophetic sleep inside the skin of a sacrificed mare, a ritual that connected kingship with horses, with sacrifice, with the goddess of the land. Archaeological evidence supports the ceremonial importance of Uisneach. Excavations at Rathnew revealed fire pits containing partially burned animal bones, each sealed beneath large flat stones. The bones showed signs of deliberate sacrifice, and the sudden quenching of the fires suggested ritual rather than practical cooking. Later, in the early medieval period, someone constructed the massive figure-of-8 earthwork on this same spot, suggesting that Uisneach's sanctity persisted across centuries. Here's what makes Uisneach different from sites like Carrowkeel. While the passage tombs were built by Neolithic farming communities, around 3000 BC, Uisneach's primary importance seems to begin later, during the Bronze Age, and especially in the Iron Age, when Celtic peoples and their Druid priesthood dominated Ireland. The passage tomb on the summit is ancient, yes, but the fire rituals, the sovereignty ceremonies, the Druidic assemblies, these belong to later traditions that actively used and reinterpreted the ancient landscape. The Christian Church eventually tried to domesticate Uisneach's power, claiming that St. Patrick met St. Bridget here, that holy wells on the hill bore Christian associations, but the older traditions proved too strong to erase completely. The Beltane fires faded after Christianity arrived, yet local memory preserved the connection between Uisneach and the May fires. In 2009, a modern revival began. The Beltane Fire Festival returned to Uisneach, drawing thousands who come to witness the ceremonial lighting of the fire at sunset, to walk between flames in the old manor, to reconnect with traditions that may be ancient or reconstructed, or some mixture of both. The question of authenticity haunts modern revivals. Are contemporary Druids at Uisneach continuing genuine traditions or creating new ones? The answer, perhaps, is that they're doing both. Just as the Iron Age Celts created new meanings when they claimed Neolithic monuments as their sacred places, West Cork holds a concentration of stone circles unlike anywhere else in Ireland. Over 100 monuments, most of them following a distinctive pattern archaeologists call the Cork Kerry type. These circles share certain features: a recumbent stone lying flat on the southwest side, two tall portal stones marking an entrance opposite the recumbent, an axis oriented toward the setting sun. The most famous and best preserved example is Drumbeag. 17 stones originally formed the circle, though several have fallen or disappeared. The monument spans 9 meters in diameter, intimate compared to the massive henges of England, but precisely crafted. The two portal stones stand nearly 2 meters tall, framing the view southwest toward the recumbent stone, a dark slab distinct from the other stones, lying flat like an altar. The local name says everything: the Druids' altar. Long before archaeologists excavated the site, local tradition associated Drumbeag with Druidic ceremonies, with sacrifice, with the old religion that Christianity had supposedly vanquished. Were these traditions memories or inventions? Impossible to say, but the name stuck, and when excavations finally happened in the 1950s, they found evidence that complicated simple narratives about peaceful Bronze Age farmers. The alignment is precise and dramatic. On the winter solstice, December 21st, the longest night of the year, the setting sun drops exactly into a notch on the distant hills, its rays striking the center of the recumbent stone when viewed from between the portal stones. This isn't approximate astronomy. This is architecture designed to capture a specific moment when the sun appears to stand still at its southern extreme before beginning its journey north again. Some researchers argue that the hillside notch itself was artificially created or modified, that the landscape was shaped to perfect the alignment. Whether or not this is true, the effect is undeniable. If you stand at Drumbeag on winter solstice, the dying sun seems to nest into the earth itself, the last light flooding across the flat, recumbent stone before darkness claims the circle. The excavations revealed more than alignment. In a pit at the circle's center, archaeologists found cremated bones, the remains of an adolescent, carefully burned and then buried with fragments of pottery. The bones had been wrapped in cloth before cremation, another indication of ritual care. Whether this was sacrifice, as some suggested, or simply honored burial, we cannot determine. The psychic Geraldine Cummins, brought to Drombeg in the 1930s, claimed to sense violence. Priests in blue and saffron robes, human offerings, darkness, and curse. Archaeology found bones and broken pottery, which can be read many ways. Beyond the circle, the landscape holds more evidence of ancient activity. Two circular hut foundations stand nearby, their stone walls still visible. Between the huts and a small stream, archaeologists excavated a fulucht fiad, a Bronze Age cooking site consisting of a stone-lined trough, a hearth, and a well. Experiments showed that this installation could boil 70 gallons of water for hours by dropping fire-heated stones into the trough. Whether this was practical cooking or ritual preparation, or both, remains debated. The fulucht fiad's presence suggests that Drombeg was more than a solar observatory. People lived near this circle, or at least gathered here regularly enough to build permanent structures. The combination of astronomical alignment, burial, cooking site, and dwelling places indicates a complex sacred landscape where different activities, ceremony, daily life, feast, death, intermingled. What role did Druids play at Drombeg? The honest answer is that we don't know. The circle dates to the Bronze Age, between 1100 and 800 BC. The Druids we know from Roman sources and Irish texts belonged to the Iron Age, centuries later. But the site clearly maintained its power across time. The cooking trough shows evidence of use into the early medieval period, suggesting that people continued gathering at Drombeg long after its original builders had vanished. The winter solstice alignment would have been obvious to anyone who spent time at the circle. The portal stones naturally draw the eye toward the recumbent, and anyone watching sunsets in December would notice the pattern. If later, Druids used Drombeg for ceremonies, they would have inherited this astronomical knowledge encoded in stone. They might not have known why the Bronze Age builders cared about the winter solstice, but they could observe the alignment and incorporate it into their own seasonal rituals. Understanding these sites requires thinking beyond individual monuments. The megalithic builders and their later Celtic inheritors created sacred geographies, networks of sites connected by sight lines, by shared orientations, by patterns that reveal themselves only when you step back and look at the larger landscape. Researchers have documented apparent alignments between major Irish monuments. Michael Poinder noted that Knocknaria, Carrowmore, several mountains, Loughcrew, Tara, and other significant sites fall along what some call a ley line crossing Ireland from west to east. Whether these alignments were intentional or coincidental remains controversial. Archaeology is deeply skeptical of ley line theories, noting that, with enough monuments, some apparent alignments become statistically inevitable. But even if we reject cosmic ley lines, the evidence for deliberate landscape planning is strong. From Carrowkeel's cairns, you can see Knocknaria 30 kilometers away, crowned by its massive cairn. The passage tombs at Carrowkeel orient toward this landmark, suggesting that the builders conceived of these monuments as part of a regional system, not isolated structures. Similarly, Uisneach's position at Ireland's mythological center meant that sight lines and roads radiated outward from the hill, connecting it to other royal and sacred sites. The astronomical knowledge encoded in these monuments is staggering. Consider what the builders had to understand: the annual cycle of the sun's rising and setting positions, which shift along the horizon throughout the year; the more complex cycle of the moon, including the 18.6-year standstill cycle; the fact that these cycles could be predicted and tracked using horizon markers, notches in hills, distinctive peaks, the positions of other monuments. This knowledge wasn't academic. It was practical and spiritual, embedded in a worldview where the movements of celestial bodies directly affected human life. The Neolithic farmers who built Carrowkeel depended on seasonal cycles for planting and harvest. The summer solstice marked the sun's power at its peak. The winter solstice promised its return from darkness. The moon governed tides if you lived near the sea, and its phases provided a natural calendar for tracking monthly cycles. But there's more to it than agriculture. The precision of these alignments, the effort required to achieve them, suggests that observing celestial events was itself a religious act. When solstice light enters a passage tomb, it doesn't improve crop yields. What it does is make visible the connection between earth and sky, between the dead buried in the tomb and the eternal cycles of the cosmos. It transforms an abstract understanding of solar movement into embodied, emotional experience. When Celtic Druids inherited these landscapes, they brought their own astronomical knowledge. We know from classical sources that Druids studied the movements of heavenly bodies and maintained complex calendars. They would have recognized immediately that sites like Carrowkeel and Drumbeag encoded astronomical information. Whether they understood the precise methods the original builders used, or whether they developed their own interpretations, they clearly valued and used these alignments in their ceremonies. The integration of natural landscape features into these sacred geographies deserves attention and careful study by researchers. At Carrowkeel, the builders didn't just construct tombs, they positioned them to command views across vast distances, to frame specific mountains on the horizon. The limestone ridges themselves became part of the monument complex. Their distinctive parallel valleys sculpted by ancient glaciers, creating the kind of dramatic topography that speaks to imagination across cultures. This principle appears repeatedly across the ancient landscapes. The hill of Tara overlooks the Boyne Valley, connected by ancient roads to Uisneach in the west. Noath and Newgrange occupy positions where the Boyne River meanders through fertile plains, their massive mounds dominating the landscape. These weren't random choices. The builders selected locations that combined practical advantages with less tangible qualities, places where the land itself seemed to concentrate power. The Druidic calendar divided the year differently than the solar calendar we use today. The four great fire festivals, Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lughnasadh, fell at the midpoints between solstices and equinoxes, marking agricultural and pastoral transitions. Yet, Druids also observed the solstices and equinoxes themselves. At Uisneach, some researchers believe the central Isle na Mirian may have served as an equinox marker, though the legend emphasizes the Beltane fires more strongly. Here's the problem that archaeology cannot fully resolve. Between the Neolithic builders of monuments like Carrowkeel and the historical Iron Age Druids, there's a gap of 1,500 to 2,000 years. That's longer than the entire span from the fall of Rome to the present day. In that time, populations changed, languages shifted, belief systems evolved. The people who erected the passage tombs may have had nothing in common with the Celts, who later claimed those monuments as sacred, and yet, places remained powerful. The Hill of Uisneach shows occupation and ritual activity, spanning from the Neolithic through the medieval period, thousands of years of continuous or repeated use. Drumbeag's cooking site operated for centuries. Carrowkeel may have fallen into disuse during the Bronze Age, but its dramatic location and visible monuments surely impressed later peoples who encountered them. We know that places like Carrowkeel, Uisneach, and Drumbeag weren't isolated oddities, but part of larger patterns of monument building and landscape use that stretched across Ireland and Britain. We know that both the original builders and their later inheritors cared deeply about the relationships between land, sky, community, and the dead. What we don't know is most of the story. We don't know what languages the megalithic builders spoke, what names they gave their gods, what myths explained the creation of the world and the ordering of the cosmos. We don't know if their descendants preserved any of this knowledge through the Bronze Age into the Iron Age, or if the Celts arrived to find only ruins and invented their own explanations. The gap between the stones and our understanding cannot be closed with certainty, but that gap itself has power. These monuments endure precisely because they can mean multiple things to different peoples at different times. The Neolithic farmers who built Carrowkeel's cairns gave them one meaning. The Bronze Age peoples who continued to bury their dead there may have had different understandings. The Celts who wove them into myths about the Tuatha De Danann created yet another layer of significance. This is where we have to be honest about what we don't know. Did any cultural continuity connect the megalithic builders to the Celts? Some archaeologists argue for population replacement, new peoples arriving and displacing earlier inhabitants. Others point to genetic evidence showing substantial continuity in Ireland's population over millennia. The truth probably involves both change and persistence, with knowledge systems transforming while populations mixed. What we can say with confidence is that the Celts and their Druids found these ancient monuments and incorporated them into their sacred geography. When medieval Irish texts describe the Cid, the burial mounds of the Tuatha De Danann, they're describing Neolithic passage tombs like Newgrange and the cairns at Carrowkeel. The mythology reinterpreted ancient structures as dwelling places of gods and supernatural beings, creating new meanings for monuments whose original purpose had been forgotten or transformed. Druids, as far as we can determine from Roman and Irish sources, served as priests, judges, teachers, and keepers of tradition in Celtic societies. They memorized vast amounts of oral knowledge, including genealogies, laws, histories, and poetry. They performed sacrifices, interpreted omens, and advised rulers. Their training took decades, suggesting an extremely sophisticated intellectual system. Did this Druidic knowledge include traditions passed down from the megalithic builders? Possibly. Oral traditions can persist for surprisingly long periods when they're embedded in ritual practice and landscape knowledge. If later, peoples continued to gather at Carrowkeel for seasonal observations, if they maintained the Beltane fires at Uisneach, if they performed ceremonies at stone circles that aligned with solstices and equinoxes, then practical astronomical knowledge could have survived, even as the mythology and theology changed. But we should be cautious about claiming unbroken tradition. The historical Druids were products of Iron Age Celtic culture, with connections to broader Indo-European religious practices found across Europe. Their specific beliefs and practices probably differed substantially from whatever religions the Neolithic farmers practiced. When Druids performed ceremonies at ancient stone circles, they may have been creating new traditions as much as continuing old ones. So what can we actually know about these lesser-known megalithic sites and their connection to Druidic tradition? We know that Neolithic peoples created extraordinary monuments aligned with celestial events, embedded in ritual landscapes that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of astronomy, engineering, and sacred geography. We know that these sites remained significant for millennia, that later peoples, including historical Celts and their Druidic priesthood, used and reinterpreted them. Today, when people gather at Uisneach for the Beltane fire or watch the winter solstice sunset at Drumbeag, they're participating in this same process, taking ancient structures and making them meaningful again, even if the meanings they create aren't identical to those the original builders intended. This isn't corruption or loss. It's how sacred places work. They accumulate meanings across time, becoming richer and more complex with each generation that encounters them. The modern Druidic revival draws explicitly on these connections, claiming the megalithic sites as part of their spiritual heritage. Academic archaeologists sometimes bristle at this, pointing out the chronological gaps and the lack of proven continuity. But perhaps both perspectives have truth. The sites weren't built by Druids, but Druids did use them. The modern revival isn't recreating authentic ancient practice, but it is continuing the tradition of finding meaning and power in these landscapes. These lesser-known sites matter precisely because they force us to grapple with complexity. Stonehenge, for all its fame, can sometimes feel like a symbol emptied of specific meaning, famous because it's famous. Carrowkeel, Uisneach, Drumbeag. These places remain embedded in particular landscapes, connected to local traditions, still capable of surprise. They remind us that the ancient world wasn't a unified thing, but a patchwork of cultures and beliefs, overlapping and influencing each other in ways we're still trying to untangle. The stones remember, even if they can't speak in words we understand today. They remember the light at solstice, the orientation toward distant peaks, the bones laid carefully in the earth. They remember fires kindled and quenched, ceremonies performed and repeated endlessly. The presence of people who found these places sacred across thousands of years. When you stand at Carrowkeel and watch sunset, strike the roof box of Cairngee. When you climb Uisneach and imagine fires spreading across the landscape. When you position yourself between Drombeg's portal stones and wait for winter's weakest light. You're not recovering some pure ancient truth. You're participating in a conversation that began 5,000 years ago and hasn't ended yet. That's the real mystery and power of these forgotten megalithic sites. Not that they hold all the answers, but that they keep asking questions we still don't know how to answer. If you found this journey through Ireland's hidden stone circles as fascinating as I did, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more of these monuments scattered across the landscape, each with its own story waiting to be told. Next time, we'll explore the passage tombs of Loughcrew, where sunrise illuminates carvings that might record the oldest astronomical observations in Europe. Until then, keep looking for the places beyond the postcard, the sites where ancient and modern meanings still overlap, where the stones still keep their secrets. And sometimes, if you're patient, share them.